Near the beginning of the Phaedo, uh, there's a discussion of suicide. And the question of suicide arises because Cebes and Simmias, who are the two people talking to Socrates, are have a question because Socrates says that he is looking forward to dying. He welcomes death because for Socrates death is actually a liberation from his body, and it's for him for Socrates death is actually something to be welcomed. And then the question arises as to, well, if you're actually looking forward to death, why don't you just commit suicide? I mean, why not commit suicide and bring it on faster? And Socrates then says that explains that suicide is wrong because we are the possessions of the gods. The gods own us as their property, and it would be wrong to kill ourselves without their permission. Okay, so Socrates says that suicide is always wrong. So that anyway, that was just a minor little discussion. The really important part of discussion centers on why does Socrates welcome death? And Socrates, to explain why he welcomes death, he has to say something about the forms. The forms with a capital F, the forms, I mean, capital F, and also you can talk about the ideas. The forms for Socrates are, for example, the form of goodness, the form of beauty, the form of the just. There's the form of the circle, and so on. These forms for Socrates and for Plato are the most real things in the world. They are what is ultimately real. Let me give you an example. An example that I think that Socrates uses. Let's say, for example, you can see many beautiful things in the world, right? Beautiful people, beautiful animals, beautiful pictures, many beautiful things in the world. But have you ever seen beauty itself? Right? You've seen many beautiful things, but do we ever perceive beauty itself? And Socrates and Plato would say no, we never actually see beauty itself. Beauty itself is eternal, timeless, changeless, perfect. Beauty is beautiful. It is always beautiful. It never changes. Beautiful things in the world do change. They may be beautiful one day, but the next day they may not be beautiful. There are many beautiful people, but everyone ultimately dies. Beauty is transitory. Everything in this world is constantly changing. The forms are eternal, timeless, perfect, changeless. Beauty is one of the forms. The highest form for Plato is the form of the good. And all the other forms participate in the form of the good because they are good. Beauty is good and it participates in the form of the good. All these forms, the form of the good, the form of beauty, the form of the just, are changeless, perfect, eternal. And the important thing for for Plato, is that we behold the forms not with our senses. Sense perception will not do it. Our eyes do not perceive the forms. None of our senses perceive the forms. The forms are perceived by the reason alone. Reason itself, for Socrates, that's the soul. The soul, or our reason, perceives the forms. Let me give you an example of, if I asked you, have you ever seen a circle? If you asked, have you ever seen a circle? Most people said, yeah, I've seen a circle. You can see circles all over the place. Where did you see a circle? How did you see a circle? Well, you use your eyes. The interesting thing, though, is that no one has ever seen a circle. In the mathematical sense of a circle is perfectly round. And there are no perfectly round figures that anyone has ever seen. And so when mathematicians, for example, draw circles, they know that what they're drawing are not circles. They are at best imitations or representations of this idea of the circle. And you've never seen a straight line either, because there are no straight lines, not in the mathematical sense of the word. Have you ever seen the number 2? Have you ever seen the number 3? You've never seen any numbers. You say, well, that's the number 3. That's not the number 3. If that's number 3, what is this? There's not 2 number 3s. This is simply a representation of the number 3. No one has ever seen the number 3. No one has ever seen a perfect circle. No one has ever seen a perfect line. Plato would also say no one has ever seen beauty. We've seen beautiful things, but we've never seen beauty itself. We've seen imperfect representations of circles, but we've never seen a circle. Mathematicians know about circles. They behold the circle through their reason alone. They think about the circle. They can have the concept of a perfectly abstract, a perfectly round object, and that's the circle. For Plato, and for many mathematicians also, many mathematicians are what are called Platonists. They actually believe the Platonic view that circles are not simply concepts in our minds. Circles actually exist. They are ontologically real. So it's not like I have a concept of the circle in mind. That's not what Plato means. Our concept of the circle reaches out towards the form of the circle, which for Plato is ultimately real. Beauty, justice, truth, these for Plato are ultimately real, the ontologically real constituents of reality. So, the philosopher, Plato says, spends his whole life trying to attain to the truth of the forms. The forms are only beheld by the reason, not by the senses. The body, our 5 senses, our body, Plato says, is a distraction. It's an impediment to knowing the forms. So, Plato says, what the philosopher, the true philosopher, and this is the type of philosopher Plato was, the true philosopher for Plato attempts to isolate his soul as much as possible during this life from the body. He attempts to separate the soul and the body in order to attain knowledge of the eternal, perfect, timeless, unobservable by the senses forms. So to attain knowledge of these forms, Plato says, the philosopher tries to separate his soul as much as possible from the body, because it's the soul that apprehends the forms. Now, so what does that have to do with death? Plato defines death. What happens when you die? Well, one way to think of it is that your soul and the body come apart. The body is a corpse. The soul is no longer in the body. The soul is now separate from the body. That's death. Plato says that death is the separation of the soul from the body. Okay? So, now, well, isn't that what the true philosopher has been seeking to do his whole life? Separating the soul from the body. And Plato says, yeah, precisely. And so that's why the true philosopher, somebody like Plato or Socrates, they welcome death because now they attain what they've been seeking for their whole life. They've been seeking to separate the soul from the body, to behold the forms, and now death is that final separation, and so they welcome it. So that's Plato's story. That's what he believes. That raises an objection. Cebes then says that has a problem with that. He says, well, even if what you're saying is true, Plato, I have a problem because how do I know that when you have this final separation of the soul from the body, how do I know that the soul doesn't simply cease to exist? Or just the soul, why can't the soul simply become dissipated and disappear when it leaves its body? So even though the philosopher in his whole life has been attempting to disengage himself as much as possible from the body, what happens if there's a complete separation? How do I know? The objection is that the soul continues to exist. Once it's separate from the body, maybe it will just disappear, vanish, like smoke in the air. That's the first objection. The first intimation or the first suggestion that the soul is immortal is the fact that it is the soul that apprehends the forms, and the forms are eternal, changeless, timeless. The objection is that once the final separation between soul and body occurs at death, how do we know that the soul continues to exist? And as you read the Phaedo, at least three times, maybe 4 or 5 times, Simmias and Cebes will always raise an objection to Plato after he explains something about the soul. They will always want to be reassured. They will want Socrates to defend the position that the soul is immortal. And this is the first occasion where that arises, because now the question is, once death occurs, how do I know the soul simply doesn't cease to exist? Okay, I'll talk about the next response to that is what deals with the theory of recollection. And Socrates will then try to answer Cebes and Simmias' objection. So I will stop at this time, and in the next part 3 I will develop this.